The Wise County Public Defender's Office operated out of a building that had been, in sequence, a dentist's office, a tax preparation service, and a campaign headquarters for a county supervisor who lost badly, and it carried in its walls the specific exhaustion of spaces that have hosted too many people with too many problems and not enough resources to address them. There were 4 attorneys, 2 paralegals, a receptionist named Doris who had been there longer than anyone and who held the institutional memory of the office the way a load-bearing wall holds a building, quietly, without recognition, and critically. The caseload was what it always was in a rural public defender's office in Southwest Virginia. Too high, the cases too complex, the compensation too low, the outcomes too often predetermined by the arithmetic of poverty and geography and the particular way that justice moved in small counties where everyone knew everyone, and the knowing was not always a benefit to the person being charged. Leah Sturgill had been there for 6 years. She was 34 years old, and she had come to Wise County from a firm in Richmond where she had been making 3 times the money and working on cases that made the news, and feeling with increasing clarity that she was doing the wrong work for the right reasons. The move to the public defender's office had cost her the salary and the prestige and a relationship with a man who had not understood why anyone would make that trade, and she had not regretted any of it, which she took as confirmation that she had made the right call. She was good at the work. This was not false modesty or its opposite. It was a plain assessment, the kind she applied to everything. She was organized, she was thorough, she was capable of the particular doggedness that the work required, the willingness to pull a thread for weeks on the theory that something was on the other end of it. She won cases she should have lost, and lost cases she should have won, and she understood that this was the nature of the system she was operating in, and she kept working anyway. The Darrell Combs case was the kind she should have lost. She knew this going in. Darrell Combs was 51 years old, a former mine worker from outside Coburn who had been charged with the murder of his neighbor, a man named Roy Estep, whose body had been found in the creek behind his property in March, with injuries consistent with the kind of violence that happened between men who had been feuding for years over a property line and a shared water source and a collection of smaller grievances that had calcified over a decade into something structural and implacable. Darrell and Roy had that kind of history. The county knew it. The sheriff's office knew it. The Commonwealth's attorney, a precise and capable man named Garrett Deal, knew it, and he had built a case around it that was not elegant but was solid. Motive established, opportunity established, physical evidence that placed Darrell at the scene, and a timeline that the defense would have difficulty disrupting. Leah took 2 weeks reviewing the file before she met Darrell. She met him in the jail in Wise, and she sat across from him in the interview room, and she asked him to tell her what happened, and he told her, in the flat, careful way of a man who has told a story many times and has learned that the telling doesn't change anything, that he had been at home the night Roy Estep died, that he had not gone to the creek, that he had not seen Roy Estep in 3 weeks since an argument over the fence line that 3 people had witnessed and that the Commonwealth would certainly introduce. That he had been alone all night, which meant he had no alibi, which meant the flat, careful story he was telling her was the only thing standing between him and a conviction. She believed him. This was not a professional assessment. It was the older, less reliable thing, the instinct that 6 years of this work had either sharpened or simply made more prominent. She believed him, and she also knew that believing him and proving it were different activities with different requirements, and that the requirements for the second were currently not being met. She took the case and started pulling threads. The first letter arrived in the 3rd week of April, 6 weeks into the case. It came in the regular mail, addressed to Leah Sturgill, Public Defender, Wise County, in handwriting she did not recognize. A small, careful cursive that had the quality of handwriting from an older generation, the letters fully formed and individually distinct in the way that people wrote before keyboards. The return address was a street in a town called Carter's Mill. Leah did not know Carter's Mill. She looked it up. She found a historical reference in a Wise County Historical Society pamphlet that she accessed through the public library's digital archive. Carter's Mill had been a small community in the western part of the county, a cluster of houses around a working mill on a creek tributary, population perhaps 60 at its peak in the early 20th century. It had burned in 1931, a fire that started in the mill and took most of the surrounding structures before it could be contained. The community had not been rebuilt. The land had reverted to timber and eventually to the Jefferson National Forest. There was no street in Carter's Mill. There had not been a street in Carter's Mill since 1931. She opened the letter. The handwriting inside was the same small, careful cursive. The letter was 2 pages long, written on paper that she noted was not modern, heavier than standard letter paper, with a texture and color that suggested age, though she was not an expert and could not date it precisely. It was addressed to her by name. It said, "Dear Miss Sturgill, I'm writing to you regarding the matter of Darrell Combs, who I understand is in some difficulty. I knew Darrell's grandmother well. She was a good woman, and her people were good people, and I do not believe Darrell did what they say he did. I know something about what happened to Roy Estep that I think would be useful to you. Roy Estep owed money to a man named Curtis Deal, not the Commonwealth's attorney, a cousin, Curtis Deal of St. Paul, and Roy had told people in the weeks before he died that he was afraid of what Curtis would do if he couldn't pay. I heard this from Roy himself at the Coburn post office in February. I thought you should know." It was signed Evelyn Cantor, Carter's Mill. Leah read the letter twice. She looked at the return address again. She thought about the Historical Society pamphlet and the fire of 1931, and the community that had not existed since then. She put the letter in the file and called the Coburn post office. She did not tell anyone about the return address. This was a decision she made quickly and held to, not because she was certain it was the right decision, but because the alternative, telling someone, required her to have a coherent account of what she was dealing with, and she did not have one. What she had was a letter with useful information and an impossible return address, and a client who was going to trial in 4 months. She ran Curtis Deal. He existed. A man in his late 40s from St. Paul, a history of financial disputes and 1 prior charge of assault that had been pleaded down. She ran Roy Estep's finances and found, with the help of her paralegal and a subpoena for Roy's bank records, evidence of a cash withdrawal pattern over the previous 6 months that was consistent with regular payments to an unidentified party. She found, through a contact at the sheriff's office who owed her a favor, that Roy Estep had made a complaint to the St. Paul Police Department in January, 2 months before his death, about a man threatening him over a debt. The complaint named Curtis Deal. The complaint had not made it into the investigative file on Roy's death. Leah did not know if this was oversight or something else. She documented it carefully and said nothing. The second letter arrived in May. Same handwriting, same paper, return address, Carter's Mill, the same street, the same impossible zip code. Dear Miss Sturgill, I hope my first letter was useful. I wanted to tell you something else I know. On the night Roy Estep died, a man named Lonnie Harbor was driving on Route 72 near the creek, and he saw a truck he didn't recognize parked on the shoulder near Roy's property. He told his wife about it that same night. I think if you find Lonnie Harbor and ask him about what he saw, he will tell you. He is an honest man, and he has been troubled by not having told anyone sooner. His wife's name is Sandra. They live on the Harbor farm outside Coburn. Leah found Lonnie Harbor. She drove to the farm outside Coburn on a Saturday morning in May and knocked on the door, and a man in his 60s answered and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting with a mixture of relief and dread for exactly this knock. He told her about the truck. Dark blue or black, older model, a dent in the rear quarter panel on the driver's side. He had seen it at approximately 10:15 on the night Roy Estep died, parked on the shoulder of Route 72 with the engine off and no one visible inside. He had not called it in because he had not, at the time, known that anything had happened to Roy. When he found out a few days later, he had told Sandra he should probably call someone, and Sandra had said yes, and then the days had become weeks, and the weeks had accumulated into the specific paralysis of a person who has waited too long to do the right thing and now cannot do it without also explaining why they waited. He was, as Evelyn Cantor's letter had said, an honest man who had been troubled. Leah took his statement. She had him identify the approximate model year of the truck from a series of photographs. The model year range he identified matched a vehicle registered to Curtis Deal. She drove back to Wise with Lonnie Harbor's signed statement on the passenger seat, and she sat in the parking lot of the public defender's office for a long time. Then she went upstairs and put the statement in the file, and did not mention the letter. The third letter arrived in June, and the fourth in July, and by the time the fourth arrived, Leah had stopped being surprised by them and started being frightened. Not frightened the way she'd been frightened in law school when she failed her first moot court, or frightened the way she'd been frightened the first time she'd had a client go to prison for something she'd believed he didn't do. Frightened in the way that she had not been frightened since she was a child. The pre-rational fear that lives below argument and cannot be addressed by evidence because it is not responding to evidence. It was responding to something else. The third letter told her about a storage unit in Norton that Curtis Deal had rented in February and vacated in April, the same time frame as Roy Estep's death. It told her the unit number and the facility name and said that Curtis had not been careful about what he put in the trash compactor at the facility, and that the facility manager, a woman named Brenda Owens, had noticed things and been uneasy about them and had not known what to do with her unease. Leah found Brenda Owens. Brenda Owens had noticed things. With a subpoena for the facility's records and a conversation with Brenda that lasted 2 hours, Leah established that Curtis Deal had been a regular visitor to the storage facility between November and March, that he had disposed of materials in the facility's compactor on 3 occasions, and that Brenda had once, helping a tenant who was struggling with a heavy item, seen inside the unit and observed materials that she described as consistent with. And here, Brenda had paused for a long time, choosing her words, cleaning up after something bad. The fourth letter gave her the name of a man in Kingsport, Tennessee, who had loaned Curtis Deal money 2 years earlier and who had never been repaid, and who knew things about Curtis's other financial arrangements that would establish, clearly, the full nature of his relationship with Roy Estep and the reason Roy Estep had been afraid. Leah found the man in Kingsport. He talked to her for 3 hours. She went back to Wise and sat in her office after dark with the file open in front of her, and she thought about Evelyn Cantor and the street in Carter's Mill that had burned in 1931, and she thought about Darrell Combs in the jail, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had enough. That was the first thing she established, cleanly and without sentiment. She had enough to get Darrell Combs out. The Curtis Deal evidence, the truck, Lonnie Harbor's statement, Brenda Owens, the man in Kingsport, assembled together, presented correctly, they did not merely introduce reasonable doubt. They constructed an alternative account of Roy Estep's death that was coherent and supported and pointed directly at someone other than her client. Garrett Deal, no relation to Curtis, a coincidence of names that Leah found darkly amusing, would have no choice but to engage with it. Darrell Combs would walk. She was as certain of this as she was certain of anything in her professional life. The second thing she established was what the letters meant. Not what they were. She was not going to resolve that question, had stopped trying to resolve it sometime around the third letter when it became clear that resolution was not available to her. What they meant was a different question, and the answer to it had been accumulating for weeks and was now complete. Every piece of evidence she had, every witness, every document, every thread she had pulled had come from the letters, not supplemented by the letters, sourced entirely from them. Without Evelyn Cantor's careful cursive on impossible paper from a burned town, she would have had Darrell Combs's flat, careful story and 4 months to find something to hang it on, and she would not have found it, because she had not found it before the letters started coming. The letters had handed her the case. Whatever Evelyn Cantor was, whatever was writing those letters in careful old-fashioned cursive from a street that had not existed since 1931, it had given her Darrell Combs's freedom, and she was going to use it. She thought about what it wanted in return. She thought about this for a long time, sitting in the office after dark, and she could not identify what it wanted. And the not identifying frightened her more than any answer would have. She filed the motion to dismiss in August. She presented the Curtis Deal evidence in a brief that was, by any professional standard, the best work she had ever done. Organized, thorough, devastating in its cumulative effect. Garrett Deal read it and requested a continuance, and then another continuance, and then in September dropped the charges against Darrell Combs. Darrell walked out of the Wise County Jail on a Tuesday morning in September. Leah was there. She shook her hand and looked at her with the eyes of a man who understood, without needing it explained, that something unusual had happened on his behalf. And he said, "Thank you." And she said, "You're welcome." And that was all. She went back to the office and closed the file. The 5th letter arrived in October. She had been waiting for it. She had told herself she was not waiting for it, and had been waiting for it every day since September, checking the mail herself rather than letting Doris sort it, looking for the small, careful cursive and the impossible return address. It came on a Tuesday. She took it upstairs and closed her office door and opened it. It was shorter than the others. 1 page. The same handwriting, the same paper, the same quiet authority of the previous 4. Dear Miss Sturgill, I am glad the matter of Darrell Combs resolved as it did. Her grandmother would be pleased. I want to tell you something now that I perhaps should have told you at the beginning, but I did not know at the beginning whether you were someone who could hear it. Curtis Deal did not kill Roy Eastip alone. He had help from a man you know. I am sorry to tell you this. I know it will be difficult. The man's name is... The letter ended there, mid-sentence, at the bottom of the page. She turned it over. The back was blank. She sat with the incomplete sentence for a long time. She looked at the blank reverse of the page. She held the paper up to the light as if something might be visible that wasn't visible in ordinary illumination. Nothing. She put the letter in the file with the others, and she thought about the incomplete sentence and the name she had not been given, and she understood, sitting there in the Wise County Public Defender's office in October with the early dark coming down over the mountain, what the incomplete sentence meant. It meant she was going to have to find the name herself. It meant the letters were not finished. It meant that whatever Evelyn Cantor was, it was not done with her, had not, perhaps, ever intended to be done with her, had given her Darrell Combs's freedom, and in doing so had given her a reason to keep listening, keep opening the envelopes, keep pulling the threads that the careful cursive pointed her toward. She thought about what it meant to be useful to something she could not see and could not understand and could not refuse, because she had already accepted 4 letters' worth of its help and used every word of it. She thought about the case she would build next, the name at the bottom of an incomplete sentence, the man she knew. She opened a new file.